In the year 1794, shrouded by the damp fog of an ever-gloomy Vermont forest, nestled far beyond any marked road and deeper than most dared to venture, stood the Wexford estate, an architectural leviathan of cold gray stone and wrought iron that loomed atop Black Hollow Hill like a mausoleum for the living. The manor, veiled perpetually by a shifting mist that seemed to weep from the trees themselves, had not always been feared, but something in the marrow of time had changed, curdled and twisted what once might have been grand into something deeply unsettling. With arched windows like staring eyes and a courtyard overgrown with dying vines that coiled around forgotten statues and half-sunken gravestones, the manor had earned its nickname, the Hollow House. To the nearby townspeople of Ashborough, it was a place only the damned could reside in, and children were raised not only with stories of the boogeymen, but of Alaric Wexford, the mad man in the mist, who drank light and experimented with souls. Alaric had arrived to Vermont under a cloak of scandal and silence, bringing with him a fortune as old as it was untraceable, and a past so heavily scrubbed that even whispers found no purchase. It was said he had once served as a physician to the Crown in England, until a grievous scandal erupted from the dark underbelly of London's royal crypts, an autopsy performed not on the dead but on the undying, as one tale went. He fled with his wife Eleanor, an exquisitely pale woman with hollow cheeks and dead eyes that shimmered like mercury, and two young children, Victor and Cecilia. Their arrival in Ashborough was quiet, but not without unease. Strange symbols were branded into the trunks of trees near the estate. Animals began to go missing in the woods, and birds never circled above the house. It wasn't long before Eleanor gave birth to their third child, Julienne, in the bitter Wye. No more deliveries were accepted. The servant who brought groceries weekly found a crow impaled on the gate, its wings nailed in an upward crucifix, its eyes gouged out. He left the food at the base of the wall and never returned. Over the next few weeks, the house went dark. No candles flickered at night. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No horses were seen. And no one came out. Letters sent were never replied to, and a local priest who ventured to offer aid found only silence and the faint sound of music, played in reverse, from behind the door. He did not knock. He did not speak of what he'd heard. He simply turned, trembling, and walked back down the hill, his hair having turned noticeably gray in the hour he was gone. The town waited. Days passed, then weeks, then months. The Wexfords were never seen again. Some brave or foolish souls tried to peer through the gates, and though they saw movement at times, it was always peripheral, always just out of reach. A silhouette passing by a window, a flash of white in the garden, a sound like glass shattering underwater. Once someone claimed they saw Victor standing perfectly still in the uppermost tower window, unmoving for hours, as if posing for a painting. But by the time a constable arrived, the window was empty, and the room behind it had been sealed with bricks from the inside. Time did what it always does. It stretched. By 1810, the town of Ashborough declared the Wexfords dead. The estate, however, remained untouched, as if nature itself refused to reclaim it. Trees bent away from it. Animals fled its shadow. Even mold would not grow on its stones. Children dared each other to run to the gate and touch it, and more than one claimed they heard a voice whisper their name the moment their fingers grazed the iron. In secret, some of the townspeople tried to investigate. They brought dogs, lights, prayer, nunnery. The trees grew stranger as they approached, tall and gnarled with bark that curled like burned paper, and the road seemed to narrow into itself, as if resisting the very notion of arrival. Then they saw it. The estate, still standing after 2 decades, its stone as dark as the day it was built, its iron gates shut tight with rust and vines, yet impossibly untouched by collapse or decay. Milo dismounted, notebook in hand, expecting to find a padlocked barrier or crumbled archway. But as he approached, a sudden gust of wind howled down the hill, sharp and cold as steel, and the gate, long believed rusted shut, slowly groaned open on its own with a sound like a scream choked in a throat too long silenced. Jeremiah turned pale, backing away, muttering a prayer his mother used to whisper during thunderstorms. But Milo stepped forward undeterred, notebook now shaking slightly in his hand. They crossed the threshold and entered the grounds, where the overgrowth had stopped precisely 5 feet from the manor's foundation, as if nature itself feared to touch the walls. The door stood closed, its brass handle blackened and frigid to the touch, but it too opened with a reluctant sigh under Milo's push. Inside, time had been embalmed, preserved with an unnatural precision. Candles still stood half-melted on mantels. Teacups with dried rings of liquid rested on lace doilies. Chairs remained pulled half out, as though their occupants had merely stood for a moment and forgotten to return. A heavy layer of dust covered everything like snowfall in a house with no windows broken. No leaks to speak of. No draught or rot. Just silence, thick and watchful. The air carried a scent of lavender laced with iron. As the team began to explore, the strangeness deepened. Claw marks in the hallway walls that began too low for a man, too deep for a child. Windows whose glass was unbroken but refused to reflect anything but pitch black, even in daylight. Portraits with faces that seemed blurred or melted, not by time, but by intention. They entered the dining hall, where a feast still sat on a table long abandoned, the meat now nothing but dry husks, yet entirely free of decay, as if it had been frozen in time, untouched by maggots or mold. It was there that Milo first felt it, that sensation of being observed not from the front nor the side, but from underneath, as though something beneath the floorboards was pressing up against the soles of his boots, listening to his heartbeat and breathing with him. Down a corridor lined with cracked wallpaper and doors that whispered when opened, they found the nursery. Child-sized furniture covered in white sheets, rocking chairs that moved slightly when no one touched them. A wall covered in penciled heights, each dated meticulously. Victor, Cecilia, Julian. The last mark, from October 11th, 1806, had been scratched through violently, and beside it, in red ink, or something that had once been red, was scrawled "Not yet." In the library, behind a bookcase that slid open too easily, they discovered the wine cellar, and at the base of its narrow spiral staircase lay a doll, handmade, porcelain face, eyes sewn shut with black thread, matching the whispers of what Julian Wexford once carried. No one dared touch it. That night they made camp inside the manor, setting up cots in the grand ballroom where moonlight from the cracked skylight painted crooked lines across the parquet floor. Jeremiah refused to sleep, clutching a rusted crucifix and muttering, "The walls breathe. They breathe like lungs." One of the assistants, Henry, wandered during the night, lured by what he described the next morning as a woman in white who wept without sound, drifting from room to room. He said she beckoned him to follow, then vanished through a mirror that no longer reflected anything but static. When pressed, Henry could not remember how he had returned to the cot, only that his boots were soaked with cellar water, though no one had seen him leave. The next night, Henry did not return. His bed was untouched, though the sheets had been folded neatly. A trail of small wet footprints led from his cot to the wine cellar door, which stood open just an inch, and from below came the faintest sound. A child's lullaby, hummed off-key and repeated in reverse. Milo descended alone, lantern in hand, heart thundering with a mixture of fear and curiosity. In the cellar, the air was colder, sharper, filled with the scent of old metal and mildew. Casks lined the walls, each branded with initials A.W., C.W., J.W., and one, cracked open slightly, emitted not wine, but the dark crimson scent of blood turned sour with age. On the floor lay Henry's notebook, opened to a page that simply read, "She said we never died, just changed." As Milo bent to pick it up, the lantern flickered, and for just a second, every cask in the room seemed to shift, as if breathing. He turned and fled. The next morning, the team prepared to leave. Jeremiah refused to re-enter the house to retrieve supplies, insisting something now stood behind every door, watching, waiting, mimicking the sounds of their voices when they weren't paying attention. Milo, shaken but determined, insisted on one final search. In the drawing room fireplace, behind scorched logs and ash that smelled faintly of burnt flowers, they found a charred book, the remnants of a diary, its pages mostly lost save for a few fragmented lines written in Cecilia Wexford's unmistakable, rigid hand. "Father says the soul is a string tied to the spine. If preserved, it can be rethreaded. He says we must die the right way." Another entry read, "Julien dreams of hollow men who wear their skin inside out. He calls them our cousins." Beneath it, a final line, almost erased by flame. "I no longer remember what my name feels like." That night, Milo finally relented. They fled at dawn, the gates creaking closed behind them without a touch, sealing them out like the final breath of something old and weary. They returned to Atborough pale, hollow-eyed, refusing to speak of what they had seen. But within days, townspeople ventured up to see the house for themselves, some drawn by curiosity, others by fear. What they found was impossible. The stone walls of the manor bleeding, dark, wet streaks oozing from cracks in the masonry, staining the ground like tears from a corpse. Every clock inside had stopped at precisely 3:17 a.m., though none had working mechanisms. Mirrors no longer reflected, only shimmered with static. And in one upstairs bedroom, someone had carved a question into the wall with fingernails. What is the right way to die? The Wexford estate was sealed by state order within the month, its property marked as cursed, the land legally uninhabitable. Yet even now, locals say the walls still bleed on autumn nights. They say if you listen closely, you will hear someone walking on the ceiling, dragging something heavy. And always, at 3:17 a.m., a light flickers once in the upper tower, just enough to cast the silhouette of a boy with hollow eyes and something in his hands, something twitching. The Wexfords may have vanished, but the house remembered. It bled their secrets into the stone, and something in its bones still waits for someone to die the right way, so it can begin again. By the year 1851, Ashborough had grown into a modest but proud settlement, its people hardened by time, superstition, and the persistent fog that seemed to rise every October like clockwork from the blackened ground around Black Hollow Hill. The Wexford estate, long sealed by state decree and left to rot behind a rusting iron gate, had become more ghost than property, a landmark of fear. Its name never spoken above a whisper, and its legend used more for warnings to misbehaving children to haunt any serious historical reckoning. But then, on the first day of autumn, when the mist lay thicker than usual, and the sun refused to pierce the gray sky, a man arrived by train. A tall, statuesque figure dressed in fine but strangely outdated attire, with a single gloved hand gripping an ivory cane topped by a carved serpent head, and eyes so pale they seemed more glass than flesh. He gave his name to the station master in a voice like velvet on steel. Henry Alaric Wexford, grandson of the original Alaric Wexford, rightful heir to the estate and all its lands. His arrival rippled through the town like a dropped stone in a still pond, disturbing old traumas, ancient warnings, and family tales long buried under polite silence. How could there be a grandson when it had been universally accepted, both legally and spiritually, that the Wexfords had vanished without heir, consumed by whatever unnatural rot had nested in that house? And yet here he stood, polite, articulate, and calm, presenting sealed documents that bore royal wax insignias, parchment pages written in ink that shimmered faintly in the light, and signatures from names that hadn't existed in government rolls for half a century. The town officials, though suspicious, were powerless to deny him. The documents were authentic, and the land, abandoned, unclaimed, and still legally tied to the Wexford bloodline, was his by every measure of law. And so the gates of Black Hollow Hill creaked open once more, the first time in decades, and Henry Alaric Wexford stepped through them like a man returning home from a long exile. That night lights were seen within the manor, first flickering candles in the upper tower, then gas lamps glowing through the windows that had been dark for 2 generations. A carriage arrived under cover of fog, delivering crates, furniture, and books bound in something that wasn't quite leather. Within days, the grounds were cleared, the exterior cleaned but never renovated. The strange rot of the place remained untouched, as though Henry did not fear it but embraced it. Those brave enough to watch from the woods claimed he walked the halls at night speaking to the walls in Latin, that music played in reverse through open windows, and that the statues in the courtyard had moved ever so slightly between dawn and dusk. Children said they heard a violin at midnight, always playing the same dissonant lullaby, and that animals now avoided the hill entirely. The townsfolk grew afraid, but Henry was never unkind. He tipped generously, paid in gold sovereigns no longer minted, and once donated a full library of rare European texts to the local schoolhouse. He answered questions with charm, but never elaboration, always steering the curious away with vague references to ancestral research and unfinished family work. And yet, the air around him remained wrong, too still, too quiet. He did not age, no one could deny this. A decade passed, and he looked no different than the day he arrived. His skin stayed waxen but flawless. His voice remained untouched by time. The black of his coat never faded, and his boots bore no sign of wear. By 1861, some believed he was not the grandson of Alaric Wexford, but the man himself, returned after decades of hiding, resurrected by means unknown. But such talk was only uttered in secret, for those who spoke too often about Henry Wexford often went missing, and those who came too close to the manor, trespassing, sneaking photographs, attempting to dig near the basement, were found days later, their mouths sewn shut with black thread, their bodies stiff as wax dolls, their eyes glassy and wide with a terror that could not be named. One such victim was Father Dunleavy, the aging priest of Ashborough, who had once performed exorcisms in war-torn parts of Europe and claimed the manor speaks not of ghosts, but of something older, something hungrier. He confronted Henry publicly, declaring him a flesh-wearer, a term no one understood but all feared. Days later, the priest was discovered in his chapel, collapsed on the altar, his chest carved open with surgical precision, and his heart replaced with a ticking clock that stopped, according to the coroner, at exactly 3:17 a.m. His journal, found beneath the pews, contained one final scrawled entry. He is not a man. He is what was preserved. After that, the town fell silent again, turning its gaze away from Black Hollow Hill. The authorities refused to investigate, citing lack of evidence, and those who might have spoken up remembered their families, their children, their own fragile hearts. Henry continued his work in solitude, expanding the manor's lower levels, though no one ever saw construction crews or building supplies arrive. Instead, strange rhythmic vibrations began to shake the ground beneath homes nearest to the hill. On foggy nights, people swore they heard machinery grinding deep underground, and occasionally a scream would pierce the quiet, so sharp and unnatural that it felt more like a memory being severed than a sound being made. By 1867, the hill had changed. The trees surrounding it had died in a perfect ring, their bark blackened, their roots exposed like veins. No birds sang there, and snow refused to settle on the earth. A thick, foul mist rose every night, smelling of old blood and formaldehyde. Then came the night of the red moon, October 13th, 1869. The sky turned the color of dried scabs, and the moon pulsed like a living organ. Townspeople awoke to find symbols carved into their doors, sigils that matched those once seen on Wexford documents, now etched in claw marks. And above the manor, lightning struck not once, but 13 times, always in the same spot. The center of the upper tower, where a flickering light remained burning even after the storm passed. Witnesses, if they could be trusted, claimed they saw figures standing in the windows, pale and still. Dozens of them, dressed in antique clothing, their mouths moving in silent unison, repeating a phrase only the most sensitive ears could catch. Return to the string, return to the string. That same night, Henry Alaric Wexford was seen walking through the town for the first time in years. He wore a new coat, lined in something too shiny, too wet, and beneath it, his chest pulsed faintly, as if something within it beat out of time. He knocked on the doors of 13 homes, and though no one opened them, each of those families left town within the week, selling their property for pennies, abandoning furniture, pets, and graves. In the wake of their departure, the town suffered a blight. Crops died overnight. Water turned black at the edges. The wind carried voices that mimicked familiar tones, and nightmares became so vivid that people began burning their own ears to stop hearing them. And then, abruptly, it stopped. Henry Wexford vanished. The manor's lights dimmed. The fog rolled back just slightly. And the house, once alive with whispers and watching eyes, went dormant. Curious townsfolk ventured up again. The gate was open, the path clear. But when they reached the manor, they found no ruin, no rot, only absence. The house stood perfectly preserved but utterly empty. No furniture, no dust, no scent. Just silence. In the library, a single chair faced the fireplace, and on it sat a book bound in skin, titled simply, Heir. No body was found. No grave was dug. But beneath the house, through a hidden trapdoor now unsealed, they found a tunnel. A long one, spiraling downward for what felt like miles, and lining the walls, row after row, were jars, hundreds, perhaps thousands, each containing something that looked almost human. Not organs, not fetuses. Attempts, versions, eyes that blinked, mouths that smiled without lips, fingers that twitched in fluid, and in one massive jar at the center, a heart with 13 stitched seams still beating, still aware. On the walls above it were words carved by blade. He did not die. He remembered. The tunnel was sealed again by terrified officials. The manor was ordered razed. But the night before demolition, a fire erupted without warning. Blue and green flames engulfed the estate. No one dared extinguish it, and when the smoke cleared, not a single brick remained. The land beneath was scorched to glass, but from the ash a single object was found. Henry Wexford's cane, serpent head still intact, eyes now glowing faintly with a light that pulsed in time with a sound none could place, like a heartbeat from a world not meant to be known. The town never recovered. People left. Ashborough was slowly reclaimed by trees and time. But Black Hollow Hill remained, a scar in the landscape, a place no one visits, a place where wind never blows and snow never falls. And sometimes, in the silence, if you hold your breath long enough, you'll hear footsteps behind you, soft, measured, polite. Henry never left. He just found the right string to pull. By the year 1870, the Wexford estate had passed from the realm of myth into something far more unsettling. A silence so complete and pervasive that it felt enforced, as if the land itself had agreed with the heavens to forget, to bury, to numb. Yet even among the ruins of memory and generations trying to rewrite what could not be understood, the truth continued to fester beneath the surface like a parasite in the body of time. Those who remained in Ashborough, fewer now, mostly old, mostly resigned, spoke in stammered riddles when asked of Black Hollow Hill. They said the fog there no longer rolled. It stood, still, immobile, like breath held just before a scream, and that no matter the season, the trees around the hill never bloomed, never withered. They simply stood, rigid, as if waiting for a command. It had been a year since Henry Alaric Wexford had last been seen, if he had ever truly existed in any form the human mind could comprehend. But the aftermath of his disappearance did not bring peace. It brought symptoms of a greater illness, a metaphysical plague that infected the soil, the sky, the language people used when discussing lineage and legacy. Town records, those not sealed, scorched, or already forgotten, suddenly vanished. Entire volumes gone from locked drawers. Birth certificates disintegrated. Gravestones in the old cemetery cracked from within, their engravings melting as though the stone wept for the names it could no longer hold. And then came the desecrations. not by vandals or grave robbers, but by something older, something with purpose. Graves were found unearthed in precise, surgically clean rectangles. 13 in total, one for each of the Wexford children and cousins once believed to have vanished with the original family line. But instead of bones or rot, the coffins held something far worse. Waxen figures molded in perfect anatomical detail, some bearing the same faces as their living counterparts from generations before, others twisted in frozen agony, mouths agape in silent screams, fingernails embedded in the coffin lids from the inside out. They had not decayed. They had been preserved, in forms that defied biology and sculptural art. Neither corpse nor replica, but something that seemed to exist between matter and memory. One had tears molded into its cheeks, and when touched, those tears were warm. Another had lips sewn shut, but when a caretaker leaned too close, he claimed to hear a lullaby being hummed from within the mouth, despite the absence of vocal cords. Then came the night the earth broke open. It was October 12th, the eve of the anniversary of the first Wexford disappearance, when a storm unlike any in local memory gathered over the town. No rain fell. No thunder cracked. Only a deep, constant vibration, as though the sky itself was growling. At precisely 3:17 a.m., lightning split the ground beneath the manor's ruins with a shriek that echoed for 7 miles in all directions. Witnesses who dared look toward Black Hollow Hill claimed they saw light pour upward from the rupture, not like fire or electricity, but like memory. Images frozen mid-motion, flashing in the sky like a broken zoetrope. Eleanor weeping into an empty cradle. Julienne walking backward through walls. Victor hanging upside down from the rafters of the library, as if gravity had forgotten him. And above all, Henry's face, smiling, perfect, ancient, mouthing a single word that no one could hear. But everyone claimed they somehow remembered, like a dream they'd forgotten until that very moment. When the town awoke the next morning, there was no longer a manor on the hill. Not ruins. Not ash. Nothing. Only a circular field of dead trees arranged unnaturally like clock numbers, surrounding a barren crater of soil scorched to glass, steaming with the stench of formaldehyde and something else, something that smelled like static and wet teeth. The air above the crater shimmered faintly, not with heat, but with suggestion, like a page being turned in a book that had never been written. Officials came from Montpellier, then Boston. Scientists, theologians, men in gray coats with glass vials and pale eyes, none of whom ever gave a name. They took samples of the soil, photographed the wax figures, though the photographs never developed, only returning as blank exposures with deep scratches across the film, as if something behind the camera had rejected the image. One of the researchers disappeared on sight, last seen staring into the scorched glass ground before whispering, "They're still in there." A week later, his shoes were found in the center of the crater, standing upright. There was no body, just the scent of lavender and dust. After that, the government sealed the land, posted warnings, and unofficially declared it uninhabitable due to geological instability. But that didn't stop the children. They came every October, dared by older brothers, drunk off stories their grandparents swore were true. They'd sneak through the trees, reach the edge of the dead zone, and stand just near enough to peer into the crater. Some said they saw reflections of themselves from the inside of the glass. Others swore they heard their own voices whisper secrets they'd never spoken aloud. Regrets, memories, fears they hadn't told a soul. But always, there was one sound that united them all. The lullaby. Soft, off-key, hummed by a girl's voice. The melody had no name, no structure. It moved like a spiral, endless and slow, and if you listened too long, you began to hum it back. And if you hummed it back, you risked answering it. And those who answered, they didn't always come home. Sometimes, just their shoes did, or their hair, or a doll made of wax painted to resemble them in eerie, childlike detail. By 1883, Black Hollow Hill had no more visitors. Parents forbade their children. Churches warned that the Wexford line had transcended sin itself. The stories twisted again. Some said the Wexfords had never truly been people, that they were avatars of some ancient principle, guardians of a secret too terrible for human minds. Others believed Alaric Wexford had unlocked something in his anatomical experiments, found a way to split a soul and preserve its halves in separate containers, one physical, one metaphysical, allowing for endless replication, endless recombination. The waxen figures, they said, were not dead. They were versions, drafts, practice. And the real Wexfords, whoever or whatever they had become, now existed in a state of preserved intention, somewhere between will and form, waiting for the moment someone opened the right door, spoke the right word, pulled the right string. By 1900, Ashborough was little more than a haunted suggestion on regional maps. The town faded, but the story did not. Occult societies began to reference the Wexford principle, a theory suggesting that death was not an end, but a fracture, and that with proper preparation, a soul could be suspended in narrative rather than biology. A secret so dreadful it was said to be unfit for the body. And it is this secret that, even now, some claim Henry Alaric Wexford carried it not in his mind, but in his bones. They say he did not burn with the manor, that his disappearance was not a retreat but an evolution, that the fire was not destruction, it was birth, that he had found a way to turn history into anatomy, to make memory bleed. And so the Wexford line did not end. It merely abandoned shape. It became something else, something quieter, broader, more patient. It left the blood and the name behind and entered the air, the soil, the lullaby. You can still feel it in October when the wind pauses too long, when your dreams begin repeating themselves with slight differences when you see someone who looks just like you walk past in the reflection of a window, but not the glass itself. That is the Wexford principle. That is what was preserved. And perhaps one day, when the time is right, when the string is pulled again and the wax is softened, something with the memory of Henry will return. Not in a body, not in a name, but in a suggestion, a voice, a lullaby hummed just off-key, from just behind you asking gently, "Are you ready to remember?"